Welcome, everyone. My name is Emily Smith, VCUarts Assistant Professor of Interior Design. And with me today, I have Dr. Sara Reed, VCUarts Assistant Professor of Design History. We're thrilled to participate this evening in the VCUarts Faculty Lecture Series so that we may share our recent work focused on Virginia patterns, both natural and man-made. This work has evolved over the past 3 years, and most recently, we involved 7 designers from across the state of Virginia. 5 of those designers join us this evening for a panel discussion. Dr. Sara Reed teaches the history and theory of interior environments to undergraduate and graduate students at VCU, as well as thesis research as part of the capstone projects for the VCU Interior Design BFA and MFA programs. Her interest in pattern research stems from her belief that the most ubiquitous elements of our built environments can yield interlocking stories of politics and economies, as well as craft and community.
Emily Smith's professional design experiences have included a wide range of project types through her work on the East and West Coasts. She teaches design studios and seminars, material studies, and collaborative study abroad work involving both interior design and craft and material studies students. Her fascination with the often untold stories discovered through pattern, as well as the opportunities pattern study provides in invigorating conventional design coursework, drives her interest in pattern research. Thank you. As this timeline attests, our collaboration as design historian and designer began in 2017 with student projects related to pattern and materiality. We became distinctly interested in the relationships between the development of patterns and the places in which they were created and utilized. In the fall of 2018, we received a VCUarts exploratory research grant to develop Patterns of Place, an interdisciplinary research project that investigates methodologies of study used to examine regional and vernacular patterns across the state of Virginia.
This project has afforded Sara and I the opportunity to catalog 81 naturally created and man-made patterns that exist across the 3 regions of Virginia. Here you can see mountain, Piedmont, and coastal plains. We've also been able to better understand the dialogue around their histories, their sources, their meanings, their uses, and their impacts. This phase of research has involved these 7 designers and academics from each of the 3 regions in documenting these patterns and motifs. As you see here in this slide, we have a number of patterns that were coming from the Piedmont region, and then a number from the mountain and coastal plains. 2 of our project participants were documenting patterns in the mountain region. 3 were focused on the Piedmont region, and 2 were focused on the coastal plains region. The primary research questions that Sara and I posed to our project participants included: what patterns are explicit to certain communities? How do we create a deeper understanding of place and identity through pattern investigation? And what are the processes that we use to identify, document, and analyze regional patterns? You can see here that each of our project participants chose different media to document their region's patterns. Each person's perspectives are shaped by their background and personal or professional ethos. Sara and my prompts to each of these people were somewhat open, and this allowed them to make unique choices regarding the media and the subject matter. On the left, you see here John Malinowski, one of our panelists this evening, and his choice to use hand drafting, acrylics, placa on muslin, software, digital textile printing, and rubber stamping. Camden Whitehead chose to use watercolors and hand drawings. Mimi Sadler's use of digital figure ground maps that were created for the city master plan, and then also her choice to use PowerPoint tools. Kevin Jones chose to use drone photography, and Helene Renard chose to use hand drawing and photography.
Kevin Jones is a practicing architect and associate professor of practice in the School of Architecture and Design at Virginia Tech. His approach to the Patterns of Place project focuses on the intersection of nature, infrastructure, and human occupation in Southwest Virginia. Capturing subjects from above in abstracted plan view compositions through drone photography helps change the scale of inquiry and invites new readings of the patterns that define the particular building culture of place. Associate Professor Emerita Helene Renard is a designer and architect and taught in the interior design and foundation programs at Virginia Tech from 2008 to 2019. Her contribution to the Patterns of Place project also reflect the region of Southwest Virginia, specifically inspired by the Blue Ridge Parkway. She notes the way in which parkway designers sought to imbue the numerous man-made landscape and building elements, fences, bridges, curbs, and shelters, with a simple and informal character, integrating them with the natural surroundings and reflecting the regional culture.
John Malinowski is a graphic designer practicing in Richmond, Virginia. His work for Patterns of Place highlights the built environment in Richmond's East End, specifically Church Hill. He titles his work East End Recusants to identify the buildings that defy expectation of the historic character of the place and thus also tend to defy rehabilitation and investment. Mimi Sadler is a historical architect and recently retired from Sadler and Whitehead Architects. Mimi's work for the Patterns of Place project uses figure ground maps from the City of Richmond Master Plan. By removing contextual details, particular features become more enhanced, such as the scars resulting from highway construction, revealing a sense of privilege in certain residential and public spaces. And last but not least, in addition to co-founding the architecture firm Sadler and Whitehead, Camden Whitehead serves as a professor in the Department of Interior Design at VCU and is director of the Middle of Broad Studio, an interdisciplinary design studio here at VCU. His work for Patterns of Place observes and interprets the landscapes of the eastern shore of Virginia where he and Mimi split their time. Camden's watercolors capture the dynamic nature of the tides that define this landscape, its history and culture.
In addition, two of our panelists are not able to join us this evening, James Hill and Allison Ewing. Architect and partner at Volz and Singh Architects in Richmond, James Hill's contribution to Patterns of Place reflects his interest in the dialogue between old and new and the building up of layers over time. Allison Ewing is principal architect at Hayes and Ewing Design Studio, headquartered in Charlottesville, Virginia. Her work for Patterns of Place centers on the natural and built environment of the Piedmont region. Her patterns reflect how local values, both past and present, influence built form, while natural patterns highlight the geological characteristics of place. And here you can see in gallery format all of the over 80 patterns that were collected from across Virginia by these 7 different project participants over roughly 5 months, reflecting diverse subjects and approaches to documentation.
So before we engage our panelists and discuss the pattern work that we have here this evening, Sara and I wanted to provide an overview of the analysis, how we went from capturing, documenting these patterns and getting to where we are today. Once we had all of these images, we employed comparative analysis and juxtaposition to expose relationships, challenge preconceptions, and provide a deeper understanding of patterns of place. Through these juxtapositions and comparisons, a number of themes emerged, many of which are featured in this panel discussion. We also examined how our individual lenses affect our work, our compositional choices and documentations, as well as our reflections and analyses. With the remainder of our time tonight, we invite our panelists to share their observations, their views on the value of pattern study, and how these patterns can perhaps yield further study. In the final 5 to 10 minutes of tonight's discussion, we will invite our viewers to join in with their own questions and contributions.
Okay, so to start us off, in this set of images, we see patterns in geometric forms in both the built and natural environments. James Hill's work on the lower left shows the regularity of a series of buildings found in Manchester on the south side of Richmond. John Malinowski's work documents distinctly block-like forms found in Richmond's East End, while Camden Whitehead's watercolor captures the changing tides on the eastern shore of Virginia. So to start us off, Camden, it seems like you've used a formal process by which you break down the water into geometric forms. So I wonder if you could speak to us a little bit more about your process.
Sure. And thanks for letting us participate in this. This has really been a wonderful experience. So a formal process, yes, but it's a formal process that I would say has evolved from an intuitive one. I've been watercoloring for 50 years, and watercolors more than photography sort of allow me and force me to slow down, really slow down enough to see. All of these watercolors were the result of a photograph. That photograph then resulted in a drawing and then to a watercolor, which resulted in a pencil diagram on the lower left of each of the watercolors. So instead of just the moment of the photograph, I'm also building the duration of the watercolor. And then it involves editing what I see and making a diagram that edits even further. All of which contribute to sort of a field of research rather than a moment of experience. And it's a field of research efforts about the pattern of that place. So I guess ultimately for me, it's about building a constructive tension between what is, so that moment during that point in a tide and its relationship to a larger world of universals and abstractions. So formal, yes, but open to the intuition that really excites what we do.
Thank you. Also noting in these images of the variety of approaches to documentation, both your work and John's work reflects an analog process, and we see pencil marks and construction lines in John's work, and would love to invite you, John, now to share your process of analysis and documentation.
Yes, thank you, and hello everyone. I guess I'd like to start by just saying that I like the sound of a pencil sharpener, I like the smell of pencil shavings, and I like the feel of a pencil in my hand. About 5 years ago, I noticed my process starting to feel not so good. And I didn't think my senses were involved enough So to restore them, I developed a hybrid practice. And this is intentionally weighted towards traditional media and techniques. Before, I think the weight was just too digital. So if you were to visit me in my studio now, you would see me ripping paper, cleaning brushes, making paste, taking breaks in the garden to pull weeds. I swing a compass. I use templates. I make rubber stamps, and I cut stencils. Near the end, the projects usually do go digital, so I have to scan. But I'm also learning that the less I clean up, the better, and that I'm finding that an irregular pencil line is closer to my heart than a vector line. Now, for this project, I chose rectangular buildings, and these are shapes I like very much. And I call the structure recusants because they refuse to conform to their surrounding vernacular built language. I also figured out early on in my process that their language was very similar to that of textile patterns. Things like quilting, cross-stitching, embroidery, and weaving. In general, as an applied artist, I always try to make things that have pragmatic and emotional value. And I think a next step for me will be to take my patterns and actually start making more textiles. And I will be using a mix of analog and digital techniques and resources. And I hope that there are things that could be worn or used in a home. This goal reminds me of the many essential textiles I grew up with and live with now. And these were made by family members and artisans. And these range from mittens, socks, pillowcases, quilted blankets, wall hangings. These are very important things, not only in their history, but also in the beauty that they provide for our visual landscape within our home.
So when noting patterns of the built and natural environments, many of these patterns reflect a sense of history through materiality and layering. And in John's work, we see both patterns noted as well as the designer's own interventions. We're intrigued by the challenge that designers face as interventionists, when and how to intervene in the built and natural environments. And so perhaps, John, you can start us off with this set of images and talking about your work and some of these interventions that you've chosen to make.
Yeah, I think you asked me to explain my ethos, and
yeah,
that's never been asked to me before, which is a really great question. But you know, I start thinking, is it a color, or is it a thorny bush, or I know it's dependent upon caffeine. So the case for intervention, I would say that all the buildings that I found and kind of fell in love with need some help. And generally, I like working on things that need help. And at best, these buildings are overlooked. But maybe I think really they are favored for demolition because they're just oddballs and maybe falling apart. But I think if they are thrown away, it would mirror patterns, another type of pattern of gentrification, that being the loss of community because something doesn't look right, whatever right is. And I'm not sure what right is many times. Now, historically, as a designer, I was schooled in the Swiss tradition of graphic translation. Quite simply, we find objects and we simplify them to minimal form with the hope of advancing communication. However, at the time when I was a student, I was a postmodern kid being schooled by modernists. Yeah, there's a lot of tension kind of there. I was learning less is more, but also feeling and hearing the vibe of my generation. And with this came an understanding and desire to create narratives. I think something kind of new brought out by postmodernists, to create narratives and fictions, and thus being able to make impossible things possible. And here I kind of think back and drift back to the lyrics of my youth, the songs that I would listen to, songs by Talking Heads, Brian Eno, King Crimson, and Frank Zappa. Well, it kind of works out this way. Like when I was on my walks and looking at these buildings, I asked each building 3 questions. And the first question was, what do you need? They told me I need a truck. And it was very obvious why the building needed a truck. It was falling apart, and a truck really needed to be taking things away and bringing things into the site. The second question was, what do you want? One building told me, I want a herd of sheep. And another one told me, I want 4 fruit trees. Both had abandoned, overgrown lots next to them. Both told me they were not in favor of new construction designed to look old. And number 3, the third question was, what do you have? And the building told me, I have a snake, and I'm terrified of snakes. So I translated a snake with a skin pattern that both the modern house and the snake agreed upon. It's kind of like putting a comme des garçons suit on a snake, I would say. All buildings really wanted new ideas, I found out in my process, and these ideas became pattern parts. And hopefully their patterns heighten awareness and visual distinction to things that are usually dismissed or left forgotten. And I guess getting back to the ethos, this is the key to my ethos. I want to lift the forgotten to the level of visual sainthood. And this is a tough task, and admittedly, I rarely am able to accomplish this.
Well, thank you, John. There's a lot that I'd love to hear more about, but I'm going to move on and talk about or hear from Helene and her work. I'm interested in hearing about the central image here, where we see a logic, a system of logic found in brick patterns or bond. And as an artist who works intimately with materiality, felt in particular, I wonder, Helene, if you can tell us about what you see as the relationship between pattern, material, and place.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah. For the purposes of this project, I defined pattern as repeating forms, materiality, and details of construction. And I chose to document both natural and human-made patterns, and I'm interested in how those things come together. I have a keen interest in patterns and the narratives attached to them. And I see patterns as clues or an index to meaning and an invitation to explore further, to dig deeper into the history of a place. And when it comes to the choice of medium, I've always enjoyed sketching because it allows me, much like Camden described with his watercolors, to slow down and observe something carefully. As I draw, I can peel away layers of detail or build up the structure layer by layer to understand the use of materials and the methods of construction. And as you just mentioned, I have a passion for materials and for felt in particular. And in my work with felt, I often look at how tailoring techniques and patterns can be used to shape a material, like industrial felt in space. I think all of these predispositions shaped the way that I approached this project. And I also thought that Kevin's drone photography and the more orthogonal view that the images offer of the mountain region made a great counterpoint to the experiential perspective-based images that I chose to create.
Thanks, Helene. And now I want to turn our attention to the two images on the lower left. So Kevin Jones's image of a railroad along the river presents us with a visually captivating play on organic and inorganic forms, calling attention to the railroad cutting through the landscape. And then Camden's lines receding into the horizon reflect the infinite ritual of the movement of sand on the shore. Camden, your work here seems to reflect this idea of a kind of ritual erosion that's an essential part of the landscape on the eastern shore. The water and land in the distance help us to see that this is not just a formal study again, but of a specific place. So I wonder if you can share with us a little bit about the work and some of these themes of regional identity, layering, and interventions.
Sure. You know, it's funny. First, I should probably clarify where the Eastern Shore is. Most people, when I tell them I'm going to the Eastern Shore, think I'm going to the river, the Rappahannock River or the James River or the York River, one of the rivers that feeds into the bay from the eastern side of Virginia. But the Eastern Shore is across the Chesapeake Bay. It's geographically part of Maryland. It's politically part of Virginia. And so it's quite remote in that sense. The way you get there is to go across an 18-mile bridge tunnel, which is pretty remarkable in itself in terms of its ability to separate this part of the state. Another thing about the shore is it's really flat. I'm not sure, but I think probably the highest elevation on the shore is probably 30 or 40 feet above sea level. Where we are is right on the shore of the Chesapeake Bay. So we're on the west coast of the Eastern Shore. And it's so flat that when the tide goes out, it probably, you know, it increases the size of the Eastern Shore, if not double, at least by half, because the water's so shallow. And I guess another aspect of the shore that sort of establishes its regional identity is the fact that it's subsiding. It's actually sinking, and at the same time, that coupled with sea level rise makes it a perfect estuary. So, you know, all the seafood that you eat that's local seafood comes from things that were born in the Chesapeake Bay. And so what's really cool about it is that you see these really, really subtle changes because of the shallowness of the water. And the waves are gentle enough that they leave a record of themselves on the beach every day when the tide goes out. So what you're seeing in that watercolor is really sort of the residue of the ripples in the water. I think from a layering standpoint, it's really amazing because the Eastern Shore has been settled for a long time, thousands and thousands of years. We find arrowheads out there that have been dated a couple of thousand years BC. And it was obviously the first thing that English settlers and colonists hit when they came from England. So there's that history, but there's also this incredible layering of light and water and earth that is pretty remarkable. And I think it's remarkable partly because you see them as interventions pretty much every day, and they really become the elements that you start noticing the interaction between. So there's the tide, which happens every 6+ hours. There's the sun, which rises and sets every day. There are the seasons, which from a natural standpoint, in August we go out and watch baby horseshoe crabs plowing their way through the sand. And then in winter, everything really goes still except for sort of the hardiest and the hardy people who walk on the beach, as opposed to in the summer, probably 40 or 50 boats go by our house every day. There's this kind of disruption as a result of that. And then I think also intervention-wise, from a personal standpoint, there's that sense of trying to connect dynamic patterns of the place somewhere between stewardship and a spirit of trying to align yourself with what a remarkable place this is.
Thank you, Camden. And now I want to turn our attention to Kevin's work. Kevin, can you introduce us to this particular work and also discuss your process and this idea of intervention in the landscape?
Sure, thanks everybody. Hey, out there in Zoom land. Wish we could be in person, but here we are. Yeah, so I began this work from having spent some time with students working in Appalachian communities on various sort of outreach and community design efforts, and got kind of intrigued by the way the different hollers are sort of shaped by many different factors. And the ones that were most telling to me were, the nature of geography, and you sort of get down in between mountains and sort of carved by rivers over millennia and millions of years. And then the sort of infrastructure or sort of agricultural and extractive industries, of coal and of farming, that play a huge part in communities in Appalachia, at least in our neck of the woods. And then sort of the culture of place of the people who live here, and sort of the sort of cultural traditions, and that it's this sort of melding of those things. So I went out sort of hunting for some evidence of those things, and have been sort of enjoying in recent years sort of the perspective that a drone offers that I can't get on the ground, and the way I can see different things at different scales. So that was sort of what I went looking for in investigating these questions. And some of the photographs I took, were sort of, I had a sense for what I wanted and went looking for them. Others were sort of discovered by happenstance and in driving and moving around. I think this one in particular, there's an old coal-fired power plant just out of the frame, an old sort of bed of coal sitting off to the side, which was a different photograph. But I'm always struck when we take some scouts and go canoeing down the New River, you think you're in nature, but then there's sometimes a road or a railroad track. That those things sort of map to the river, because that's where the land gets flat and it's easier to sort of build and construct those pieces of human infrastructure in that flat area, as opposed to sort of going up and down or through the mountains. So I think this particular image, and as I've spent a little more time with it, this question of time that Camden was just speaking about, that there's sort of layers of time of human industry, roads and train tracks. There's sort of layers of time of nature, the river, the sycamore trees. This was sort of late fall, so the leaves had fallen. You know, even day to day, you know, the shadow patterns would sort of change as the sun set. This was late in the afternoon, so you get the kind of the long shadows from the west, sort of peeking over the mountain. So, you know, I think these questions, sort of time, and then this layering of humans and industry and nature, were sort of how I was approaching this. And I found the drone offered sort of an interesting perspective, and then my own sort of compositional lens of liking to frame things a very certain way in composing photographs.
So continuing on this theme of interventions, these images capture the theme of dissection, of infrastructure such as electrical lines and highways bifurcating the landscape and urban areas. In particular, Mimi Sadler and Kevin Jones' choice of aerial perspectives underscore these interventions in a very dramatic way. Kevin, I think we'll start with you. And I was wondering if you could please tell us specifically more about these images that you documented in Southwest Virginia.
Sure. So the top one is a stretch of Route 460 down here. And what you're looking at on the right is where the mountain has been blasted away to sort of, unlike where I was just speaking, where the road sort of skirts along the river. Here is one where the mountain was sort of removed in order to make way for the road and for sort of human movement. You know, you get those sort of telltale patterns from drilling the mountain and dropping dynamite down in. So you always get these kind of striation patterns. And I think that, plus sort of the flatness of the road, just compositionally, I think was interesting to me. So it's really about that, the pattern of sort of removing the mountain, the tool marks that are left over from that human act of taking the mountain away. And then the one below is maybe another sort of subtractive, less than great, perhaps, sort of intervention in the landscape. It's a little hard to perhaps see, but this is the sort of familiar clearing of trees so that power lines can be run. So you get a power line that's 30 feet wide, but you clear 100 feet worth of trees, and these things cut, you know, just straight across the landscape, and being able to sort of get up above. And again, in this image, it's a little bit in the distance, but where the trees and the horizon, you get a sort of a different line of the horizon, the way the mountain meets the sky by this subtraction. So I think both of these were a little bit about sort of the patterns of humans imposing themselves on the landscape.
I think one of the really interesting things too about this slide is, you know, Kevin, to be able to see what you were able to capture from a drone's perspective in terms of these electrical lines, and then to see Allison Ewing's photo from a human perspective or a ground perspective, and how just by changing the medium and being able to elevate or shift the perspective, we're able to see the source and sort of the context in a dramatically different way. Well,
I think it changes the scale. You know, you feel small next to those giant power lines, but when your eyeball is looking through a drone up above, and you know, you seem to have a little bit of an advantage over the power lines in those moments.
Well, and you also, just in terms of thinking, what is pattern? You know, when we think of pattern, I think a lot of us, your first thought might be a textile pattern or a brick pattern, you know, things that repeat, a motif that repeats. And I think here, one of the things I get excited about is this idea that we're starting to see impacts of different elements and different industries. And we think about pattern as repeated actions. We see repeated motif from the ground perspective of these towers as they move down the line. And then just by shifting the perspective and seeing it from the air, we sort of lose the source and the motif of the tower, and instead see the line that it creates, those points along the line. Mimi, you have referred to the red lines, which reflect highways through Richmond, as scars. Will you share with us your documentation process and what you were exploring in these patterns of Richmond neighborhoods?
Yes, happy to, and great to be here. The patterns I looked at are derived from the city's master plan and I manipulated the figure ground maps in the city's master plan through PowerPoint. It's all a digital process, unlike John's and Camden's work. As a historical architect born and raised in Richmond, I've lived and worked in most neighborhoods in the city. So I was really interested in several themes that are shown when you abstract the master plan drawings. And among those things is the power of green space to enhance public and private property. In the two neighborhoods I was looking at most closely here, Jackson Ward at the upper end of the diagram and Oregon Hill at the lower or south end of the diagram or pattern, you know, there's not much green space, not much public green space. So I was also looking at the vulnerability of unprotected historic fabric, in particularly in working class neighborhoods like Jackson Ward and Oregon Hill, when they're confronted by urban renewal and transportation priorities. I was really interested in the ability of politically and socially powerful groups to either protect neighborhoods or to insulate neighborhoods, isolate them, or destroy them, as happened in this case. The case with Jackson Ward and Oregon Hill, which were almost destroyed by highways created in the 60s and the 70s in Richmond. Jackson Ward and Oregon Hill are neighborhoods that are connected by Belvedere. You know, it's very central to the VCU campus. And they were neighborhoods that were originally defined by uninterrupted urban grids that were integrated into the urban pattern. But as you can see, Interstate 6495 on the north and the Downtown Expressway on the south really cut through and destroyed those grids. The fragile fabric of Jackson Ward continues to be eroded because that neighborhood is so frequently used. The development pressures on Jackson Ward are pretty heavy. Whereas Oregon Hill has protected itself through some very fierce involvement of property owners in that neighborhood. The cool thing about the damage that was, well, the only upside of the damage wrought by both these highways and the constant pressure on VCU on both neighborhoods is that these alterations and expansions awakened really effective activism in both neighborhoods, where the citizens are increasingly engaged in trying to save both neighborhoods. Thanks.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So sort of continuing with some of these points, these images highlight human gathering, especially in civic and sacred spaces. Kevin's aerial photograph captures a Sunday service in southwestern Virginia, while the green spaces in Mimi's Fan District image suggest intermittent areas to congregate in the pocket parks in the Fan neighborhood here in Richmond. In addition, Mimi's image of Richmond's Capitol Square captures green space around the Capitol building, notably designed by Thomas Jefferson as a temple to democracy. And then below, we see Allison Ewing's image of an equestrian statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee in Charlottesville. Notably, these public spaces have changed dramatically since the summer of 2020, when activists demanded intervention and reasserted ownership. Kevin, perhaps we could start with you, and you could share a little bit about this particular image and your choices.
Sure, happy to. So this was one I went looking for, having sort of driven through Southwest Virginia on back roads and things. You find many of these sort of small white clapboard community churches in small, you know, rural communities around, you know, and this it's really about the sort of intimacy of a communal gathering. You know, here there's, I don't know, 20 cars, there might be 40 or 50 people sort of gathering on a Sunday. So this was one I sort of went looking for, like kind of where I was going to be driving that day, made sure it was a Sunday, found some churches, you know, sort of scouted it out because I had a sense for sort of what I was looking for, you know, and spending a little more time sort of reviewing and looking at these, you know, the sort of the relationship of people and transportation and how they get there, you know, sort of pops up interesting questions similar to some of the others. But I think this one was really about, you know, independent of sort of the infrastructure and nature piece, the sort of role of community, particularly in rural communities, and those moments to gather around sort of shared values. And I'm not a particularly religious person, you know, but, you know, I think the the corner store used to occupy some role like this in small towns, and some of that's sort of going away as these towns start to see folks leaving to pursue opportunities elsewhere. So questions of economics are embedded here, I think, as well. But this one, I think, was really just about sort of an intimate gathering tied to a specific particular place, a particular time, and a sort of shared set of beliefs or values.
Thank you. Mimi, it's interesting to note that the kind of shape that the cars create in Kevin's work is similar to the green spaces in the fan district. Can you talk about how the grid in this neighborhood allowed for the creation of these parks and how that might encourage community?
The Fan District has been one of my favorite neighborhoods in Richmond since I was a child, and we begged our parents to drive us through the Fan District so we could look at the hippies. The angle streets of the Fan start on the left at the gorgeous park created by the museums on Arthur Ashe Boulevard. And the Fan District terminates at the east end with Monroe Park, which was once a fairground. In between, the two grids that come together, the grid generated by the river and the grid generated by Broad Street, the resolution of those grids create these delightful triangular pocket parks. And when you think about it, the experience of the Fan is one of walking or running or biking through the Fan District and coming upon these delightful triangular parks. Another fabulous thing about the Fan District is that it's punctuated on its north end and at other ends by interesting statues. In the museum grounds, we now have Rumors of War, which is one of the most prominent statues in the city at this time. On the north side, we have the ever evolving, or the most recently evolving statues of Monument Avenue, which have been recognized nationally and even internationally as very significant public protest art.
And Mimi, how would you compare that to what we're seeing in the image that you created responding to the Capitol?
Well, Capitol Square is an artificially created aberration in the urban grid. And it's an aberration that's created to honor the importance of democratic government. And interestingly, Capitol Square, that's another green, beautiful green space in the city, is either treated as a beautiful open public park where we can have lunch or read a book on the steps of the Capitol, or it becomes fortified, as it has been in recent weeks due to the threat of civil unrest. So the Capitol Square, in contrast to the Fan District, which almost evolved organically, happily, and almost organically, Capitol Square is an artificial construct to demonstrate and symbolize the importance and centrality of a democratic government.
Thank you. We can go to the next slide, please.
So in this set of images, we see juxtapositions of building types that reflect regional materials and construction elements, from the brick arcade at the University of Virginia to the aerial view of mobile homes in southwestern Virginia, and the traditional timber construction also used in the same area. In particular, Helene's images of the structure at Rocky Knob along the Blue Ridge Parkway reflects a typology, a type of construction that intentionally recalls a historical and perhaps romanticized image of frontierism. Helene, can you share with us some of the discoveries that you made in your documentation of this area?
Yeah, so I consulted a number of sources in my quest to learn more about the Appalachian region and the Blue Ridge Parkway. The key one being Visual Character of the Blue Ridge Parkway, published by the U.S. Department of the Interior and the National Park Service in 1997, which explains the purpose of the parkway and the design intent of Stanley Abbott and his design team. It also catalogs the many architectural and landscape intervention types and their detailing. A section entitled Roads in America concludes by saying, quote, "The American Parkway derives its distinctive quality from its alignment within the landscape and how it reveals the story of the region to travelers," end quote. And the Blue Ridge Parkway is cited as an example of harmony between a road and its context. Stanley Abbott is quoted throughout this text, and he describes the design as sculptural, a composition with, quote, "fields and fences, lakes and streams, and your problem is that of placing the roadway in such a position as to best reveal them," end quote. So the designers sought to strike a balance between reclamation and preservation of the mountain farm on the one hand, and improvements or additions that were authentic to the region and character on the other. And you see also repeated throughout this idea of making the mountain farm the centerpiece of an effort to capture and preserve the pastoral character of the region. There were also details about how excess timbering and poor farming practices had caused soil erosion, so drainage and water runoff improvements were made. And construction began in 1935 and involved the Civilian Conservation Corps and the Works Progress Administration, two Depression era programs created under FDR, and hired local workers to aid in the construction. And the new roadway was seen by many as an economic stimulus to the struggling Southern Appalachian region and economy on the one hand, and other text comments on the frustration of the locals that the roads were not for bringing their goods from the farm to the market. And I also read that, quote, "a few dozen families had to be moved out of the path of the Blue Ridge Parkway," end quote. And Stanley Abbott felt that good design implies restraint, a principle that I think you see throughout the structures and other interventions along the parkway. And all buildings should be generated from the same architectural philosophy. He felt, using the same palette of materials and detailing. The larger images that you see here on the right-hand side of the slide are of the Rocky Knob shelter at milepost 168.2. And this was the first building constructed along the parkway and is a 16 by 16 shelter with a stone chimney and an expansive view of the Rock Castle Gorge below. The structure was built of exposed heavy chestnut timbers on a base of horizontally laid flagstone, and the roof is made of hand-split oak shakes on exposed wood purlins. It's referred to as an example of early rustic park architecture and an honest expression of structure. The smaller image in the middle is the split rail fence at milepost 168.6. And that was placed there for aesthetic reasons. It, quote, "defines an outdoor edge and adds visual interest and detail to the open space," end quote. "It makes a graceful arc that visually reinforces the curvilinear alignment of the parkway." So there again, we have a balance between aesthetic and functional considerations, and we see the use of historic detailing to create new structures that are to be used by the parkway visitors. Thank you.
And Kevin, the drone image that we see below left is shows us a set of mobile homes in Maybrook in this same region where Helene was documenting her work. Can you speak to us about your choice to document this image? Was it similar in terms of seeking it out as we saw in the last slide?
I think this one was more of sort of discovered while moving about, as opposed to strategically going in search of this. Though these are sort of easy conditions to find in many communities in Virginia and certainly in Southwest Virginia. You know, I think this one, you know, and listening to my colleagues speak about things, you know, John went in search of recusants, buildings that sort of resist typical typologies, right? And in terms of a sort of housing typology, mobile homes maybe occupy that sort of recusant or recusant, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, but the, you know, sort of an other type. You know, I think even comparing it to Allison's image above, you know, that I could look at these things and say, well, there's a repetition of pattern and of a certain scale, and there's an order in the images, right? But then if I start to look at other questions, those two images are completely different in terms of, you know, one that's a symbol of status and another that's a symbol of perhaps of inequity or of lack of status, right? So, I think this image was interesting to me, partly because of the one mobile home that's sort of diagonal, and sort of excusing itself from the regular order of the rest of the community. But actually, I started looking more and more at sort of the in-between spaces. If the lines of the mobile homes make a pattern that's somewhat maybe universal or sort of typical, right? A certain proportion, a certain length, sometimes it's often a certain color. That the in-between space where individual folks who live there sort of occupy the space in between in different ways and sort of make it their own. So I think that was sort of interesting to me as I've spent more time with this pattern exercise, is sort of what is universal and what is particular, what is the value in looking at the particulars of patterns as opposed, in addition to the sort of universal qualities that are sort of easily legible. So that even this one, you can identify sort of new roofs versus old. So it starts to tell different stories of individual narrative in addition to the larger one about a desire for community, as well as sort of even larger questions of maybe politics or economics or equity.
So in these next 3 slides, we want to share some additional themes that we explored in our analysis, which may prompt some further discussion in our Q&A. Here we are struck by the visual juxtaposition of colors and textures. This set of images speak to the particularities of each region's economies, notably agriculture. In particular, the lush green landscape of Camden's watercolor of soybeans on the Eastern Shore sits in sharp contrast to the hay bales and coal pits that we see in Kevin's photographs from Southwest Virginia. In these images, we see the demarcation of spaces through fencing and elaborate borders. We ask the questions of invitation. How do these interventions either include or exclude? In particular, Helene's image of the fence line on the Blue Ridge Parkway suggests a regional specificity distinct from Allison Ewing's image of serpentine brick walls. And Mimi's aerial perspectives of Richmond neighborhoods connote a sense of access and privilege. Her image of the Windsor Farms neighborhood reflects a web-like structure that is intentionally exclusive in character. And last, here we note the concept of time as a natural process and as a societal process. The idea of capturing time is central to Camden's watercolors. And this image from Allison Ewing of an impeach sign in Charlottesville calls attention to the ways in which patterns can be reflective of a moment in time. Although Camden's image has a universal quality, the subject of water, specifically the Chesapeake Bay, is also politically specific. Water rights, the role of water in the Eastern Shore economy, the health of the bay, all of these are central to life on the Eastern Shore. And John's work highlights the word recusant, a person who refuses to submit to authority. John seems to pose the question, when and how do we challenge the structures of our daily lives, and when and how do we intervene?
So we've seen how each of the panelists have been driven by their personal lens, their process, and how themes have emerged. Each participant asked what is local and why, what is universal and what is particular. We'd love to invite the audience to share questions in the chat, in the Q&A. And while those are being generated, perhaps our panelists can share any takeaways or last minute observations with us.
It was interesting when one of our earlier discussions, Kevin was talking about big farming in Southwest Virginia, and the farming is about 95% of the economy on the Eastern Shore. And having gone to school in Southwest Virginia, I know it's hard to find a field that's not interrupted by a mountain or a valley or it's hard to find flatland out there. Whereas on the Eastern Shore, you'll have soybean fields that are 200 acres, one field, 200 acres. And when, at harvest time, it's quite an event out there in terms of tractor trailer trucks lining up and having soybeans blown into them, by the ton. But I think it's interesting how the lay of the land so often governs the scale of the pattern. These soybean fields, they turn on one hand up close from the pattern of the sort of triangular pattern of the leaves to, as you get further away, this texture that really becomes sort of, how you see the land from a distance. It's really remarkable.
Thanks, Camden. We do have a question from the audience. We have a couple of questions. The first question is, could you speak about your process of recording and why you chose to include, omit, or embellish context, anecdotes appreciated? So if any of our panelists have thoughts about their process of recording and why they chose to include, omit, or embellish context.
I'll maybe start with this one just by virtue of sort of working with a drone. You have to be strategic, right? You get 20 minutes of battery life, you know, and you got a couple of so I would sort of be planning ahead about where I needed to be. And then sort of, so that act of curation was happening not on the fly, excuse the pun, but sort of ahead of time, and then sort of starting to crop. But I think, and similar, I think when we were talking, you know, as a group over these last weeks, you know, that they're really each of our individual particular perspectives on sort of artistic sensibilities and compositional choices come into play. So for me, I'm always interested in sort of the way things present themselves clearly against a background, sort of figure ground relationships. So the cropping and editing, you know, is a lot about that. But I think, and maybe this is similar to, there's another question about that the great outdoors is inherently large. You know, is it difficult to focus? You know, I found that after mulling with this project for many months, you know, that I had to sort of narrow down what was interesting to me so that I could go out and actually find and look, as opposed to, you know, because there is so much, like given an infinite number of possibilities, how might you approach it? So I think this kind of curation and planning was an important part of, at least of mine. And I think it's a similar theme that's run throughout some of everybody's.
We have a few more questions that I know we're running up against, I think, our time, but I'll go ahead and pose these as well. First one is, do the participants have any thoughts on the idea of scale? The great outdoors is inherently large. Was it difficult narrowing down your focus to certain patterns? And did you ever feel like you were excluding anything?
Well, I was kind of overwhelmed by the scale. And maybe that's because I'm not, you know, a different background as a graphic designer. I'm usually working with things quite small. And so my first attempt was to drive, and I came back really frustrated. I knew early on I just didn't want to find a pattern and document it. I wanted to find the raw materials. So for me, the scale went from really a thing with 4 wheels to my thing with 2 feet. And I started just to be, make it simple and just start walking in my neighborhood.
It's interesting because I think Emily and I take so much of what we've learned from our panelists and through this project to our own courses. And I know that that's something I really encourage my students to do, is just to take the time to just slow down and observe their own neighborhoods and to try to take in the patterns that they're noticing. So it's really interesting to see all of the different methods of documentation and approaches just within that kind of, you know, unique set of constraints.
It's interesting too, sort of the tension between backing off in your view to see the, you know, the whole of what it is you're looking at, and then zeroing in, and that kind of wonderful dance between the two. You know, when you back off enough, the repetition and the geometry makes itself very evident. It becomes a texture of the same thing. And then if you allow yourself to zoom in a little bit, you start seeing all the difference within the sameness. And you know, particularly in these ripples in the sand, you know, you first look at it and you say, oh, that's a lot of, you know, parallel ridges in the sand. And then you see, oh, there's where a clamshell is and it's disrupted, or that's where a bird walked, or something like that, that just sort of grounds you in the sense of, oh, there are things happening here. And it's not just a continuous surface.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, Camden, because you're talking about it in a formal sense and composition, where I was really thinking about the same thing in a conceptual sense, and how to communicate it, like the big picture. I think my work really relates closely to some of the things that Mimi's talking about, you know, and basically it's the big picture is, what are we doing to our neighborhoods? How are we solving problems, or are we creating more problems? So it's like the big picture of the neighborhood versus the small picture of the house, I think, conceptually.
We have a specific question for John about his documentation. It says, to those documenting pattern in their retrospective fields, are there any tips in documenting these patterns in a multi-technique style? Do you start with one or more styles of documentation while on your walks?
Well, I needed to get, it's a long time ago, so I have trouble remembering, but I had to get something to work from. So I believe the initial documentation was either through a street search in Google after I found the building, or else just an iPhone photograph. And then it was quickly rendered into a contour of lines, if that answers the question. And then after that, the drawers open up and the different media and the different tools start to come out. And then they start to kind of solve and answer questions as to what is most appropriate. And when I'm talking about fictions, that opens up a lot, So, it's okay to put, not Batman, but Robin into one of the images. that starts a narrative for me in solving the problem, but hopefully, that kind of begins a poetic drift for the user of the piece as well.
There's a question here that's sort of geared toward Mimi's work. And the audience member that's asking the question says, I am wondering how the participants feel the colors evident in real Virginia environments, structures, and plans that they encounter inform their representations of the patterns they present. And I think Mimi, maybe this is touching on the question of what is the value of removing context, or by eliminating some of the information that exists in these places that you're documenting. And perhaps you could touch on that.
Like Kevin, I narrowed down my problems or consideration of the pattern to things that fascinate me and things that I love. So I picked neighborhoods to look at that, that I've always loved since childhood, or been interested in since childhood. And green necessarily, the green space of the Fan District, particularly in those triangular parks and in the parks, the two parks that bookend the Fan District, it's the natural way to render those. As you know, from our discussions, from our long discussions prior to this presentation, we talked about whether my images should be presented in the larger context or they should be presented solely as the abstraction. And the message came through, the message of the impact of patterns in the city of Richmond came through more clearly in the abstraction than in the images with the total context. But again, I was driven by what I knew and loved, and realized that it was the green space in these neighborhoods or places that made even the built environment more compelling. The green setting, the landscape, and the talented or accidental landscape designers who created and enhanced those settings.
Well, I think, Sara, we might need to wrap up and find a way to, we have a few questions here that I think Sara and I could touch on sort of in wrapping up. I will say that one of the questions is coming from my mother, and Mom, yes, I will follow up with John and Camden so we can talk more about quilts. Yeah. But there's a question about whether we are going to continue this work. And to answer that question, the short answer is yes. Sara and I think, we didn't really touch on it in this particular talk. There was a lot to cover, but the challenge of creating interdisciplinary research projects. I'm an interior designer. Sara is a design historian, and yet we work in the same department at VCUarts, the interior design department. And so there was that natural connection, but really all of this work stemmed from Sara and I just sitting around talking about pattern and admiring patterns and being particularly really excited about how they reveal stories. And so we had started by looking at historical patterns in textiles. And I think, over the years, we have looked at specifically emblems of colonialism here in where we now call Virginia. And I think that we will continue to sort of investigate and think about there's the research of pattern. There's also pattern design. There are projects like this where it's observation-based. And I think in terms of one of the other questions that came through, someone asked, so did you establish over time a definition of pattern? And I think that for me, the funny thing is instead of it sort of narrowing, it's actually opened up, which happens a lot in research, right? That's really normal. But I think one of the things that really sort of came through over the past couple months in particular is the idea of visual languages that talk about regional identity. And so it's a little bit bigger than the word pattern. And that's kind of where I am right now. Sara, I don't know if you're somewhere else.
Yeah, and I think that there's such a value in collaboration, as we've touched on, but also just opening this up to all of these other folks who have a distinct way of working their process. That has really been so enriching and challenging in the way that I've conceived of pattern, because I was honing in on the detail and the of the built environment in particular, and this project has really opened up so many new ways of seeing. So I'm incredibly grateful to all of our participants, and especially this panel, because they spent a lot of time just kind of back and forth and opened up so many different themes that emerged, and helped us to see things in new ways. So it's been an invaluable lesson for me. So thank you.
Well, I think with that, we're at the end of our time. So we would very much like to thank the VCUarts Dean's Office for the exploratory research grant that has helped us to advance our work over the past year and a half. We would also like to thank the VCUarts communications team for allowing us to do this event tonight. And then last but not least, we'd like to thank our panelists that very graciously gave up a good bit of time over the past year and a half, and especially this evening, providing us with your expertise and your time, your humor, your patience. It's been really exciting to be able to work with everyone. We do have a website, patternsofplace.me. So if you want to see more about what we're working on, we'll be uploading and adding to it as we keep moving forward. And then finally, next month, VCUarts looks forward to presenting the next faculty lecture taking place on March 2nd at 5:30. And this is going to be with a colleague of ours from Sculpture and Extended Media, Assistant Professor Masa Lemu. So thank you all so much.